Back in the winter of 2010, so this would have been January, I stayed in a family-owned cabin for the entirety of the winter. This was up in the mountains of Colorado. I won't tell the area because I want to keep it private, but I can tell you that you get a lot of snow on average, so it's kind of more of a matter of survival sometimes. I prepared beforehand and packed as much supplies as I could, just to see if I could last all winter long, which I managed to, living off the bare necessities, and while not starving, surviving, just to see if I could put myself through it and survive. I am no stranger to survival challenges, and this is just one of many that I've done. But I'm not writing to you to boast about my survival skills or my adventures, because during this time, January into early March, something much more grand took place around the cabin that I was at, which, by the way, is very desolate and very remote. There's nobody around, not a soul for miles and miles. It's even quite a trek to get up here, and as soon as snow comes, well, consider yourself lucky if you can make it. A snowmobile was pretty much all I had to get around, and that was when weather permitted. Before doing this challenge, my family regularly keeps up on the cabin, interior, exterior, roofing, and there's always ample amount of wood to use for a fire, so I never had to go out and split my own. Thank goodness. But the woodshed, which held tons and tons of wood, I don't even know how many cords, but more than I could count, was housed just about 100 feet away from the cabin, which meant I daily had to make trips to and from just to keep the cabin warm, and I did all my cooking on the wood stove, which required heat and required wood. It was sometime early January, and I want to say it was evening time. I can tell you it was already dark, so who really knows, because the sun sets at about 4:30ish. I was cooking a stew, I believe, when I began to hear horrible screaming coming from outside. I ran to the window and looked. I couldn't see anything, even though it was lightly snowing. It sounded like bestial screams hollering back and forth. It was bizarre. Imagine hearing the sounds of two dinosaurs fighting, or giants fighting. It sounded absolutely vicious. I have no other words to describe it. The noises went on for quite some time, maybe about 10 to 20 minutes, on and off. I never saw what made the noise, but it sounded like an absolute war zone. Screams, cries, bangs, like something hard hitting a tree. I began to wonder if I was going crazy, or I was genuinely hearing two Tyrannosaurus Rexes duking it out in the middle of the Colorado mountains. Well, it eventually stopped, and I can't quite remember if it was the following morning or the morning after the following day, where I went out to go get some wood for the fire, and standing not too far on the hillside was a tall human-like shape that looked very scrawny and unkempt from the waist down, but had huge overly sized shoulders and large antlers, kind of like caribou do. But because of the distance and where the sun was positioned in the sky, it appeared to be mainly a silhouette. It made me stop in my tracks, and I thought somebody, maybe an indigenous native or somebody, was out here, covered in animal skins. But it didn't look right. It didn't look exactly human, and it was way taller than that of a person. After studying this figure for a moment, I dismissed it, went and grabbed a nice bundle of wood, and as I'm walking back to the cabin, just glanced over my shoulder out of curiosity to see if this figure was still there, or perhaps had moved closer, when in reality, the figure was now gone. Where the figure was standing, even though it was on a hillside, there's no way it could have moved that fast to be completely concealed against the white backdrop of the snowy mountains. I didn't think much of this. It was a little startling, but maybe I was just starting to become stir-crazy. My eyes were just playing tricks on me, I assumed. The day went on as normal, and for the next few days, I began to feel a growing sensation that I wasn't alone, that there were others around me. Maybe people, maybe something more. I couldn't describe it. Then, that feeling began to turn into worry, and finally into danger, in just a matter of 3 to 4 days, as I felt whatever this energy or force was closing in on me. But yet, after looking around, looking out the windows constantly, in fear that something, or multiple things were coming after me, there was nothing. Nothing but the beautiful backdrop of snow and the clear, crystal clear air of the mountains. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have bouts of insanity, or at least where I think I was insane. Maybe this was my shining moment, like the movie, where the dad begins to just lose it. Maybe there was something about this cabin. Those fears and thoughts were quickly put to rest by what happened shortly after this. Directly down south from the cabin, down the hillside, is a large aspen tree, separated from the others. I took a step out one afternoon, just to catch some breath air, thinking I was literally going insane, when my eyes caught something that didn't quite make sense. It was a head, peering out from behind the tree, trying to remain concealed, but clearly visible from my standpoint. I don't think whoever or whatever this was realized I could see it, because it stood out like a sore thumb. It's what I saw that didn't make sense. The head that was looking at me wasn't that of a person, like you're probably expecting it to be, and it did not have antlers. It was the black head of a very large canine, except it was higher up from the ground than I can stand, meaning that the possibility of this or person being bipedal, which is why at first I assumed it was a person, was all the now real. I couldn't see any eyes or any discernible features, just the shape of a large dog. Maybe a Doberman Pinscher, as far as shape relating to the silhouette. But whatever or whoever it was very visibly watching me from behind this large aspen tree, maybe about 150 yards downhill. It kinda creeped me out. Now, I knew I wasn't crazy. I had to think of what I can do. I went back inside the cabin, kept the door locked, and now I had to be much more methodical about when I got wood, and how I got wood. Was I even safe? I always kept a machete on me, just in case. Not necessarily to fight off bears or anything, but it's always good to have when you go into the wild, even though I would be staying in a cabin for the majority of the winter. It was this moment, right after I came inside, that I realized my insanity wasn't necessarily my insanity, that there really was something afoot. Now, after seeing the gaunt figure with huge caribou antlers and this large Doberman Pinscher dog head not far off down the hill, what was happening? I contemplated this the rest of the night, and it very much disturbed me. And it was that night, I do remember, that I was awoken by something very large walking through the snow around the cabin, tapping ever so lightly against the wood, like it had nails, and it was just slowly dragging them. And sometimes I would hear grunts and snorts and sniffing, keeping me awake the entire night, because I'm a fairly light sleeper, and this just didn't allow me to fall into a deep REM sleep like I needed. So every time I would hear the slightest noise, I would hear this thing walking around all night long. I think this night was when I began to feel the pinnacle of my emotions, that I was truly in danger, and I was indeed being stalked by some horrendous, crazy mountain predator that I didn't even know existed. I couldn't ignore this anymore. This wasn't just somebody hunting me in a costume, or some crazy lunatic you'd expect to see in a movie with an axe. This was far beyond anything of my comprehension, and unfortunately, my story gets worse. The next morning, I remained pretty paranoid after the events of last night and the previous day. I wasn't exactly sure what to do, but I had to get wood and maintain heat to cook and survive if I didn't want to die of cold. I kept my machete on me at all times, constantly glancing over my shoulder, looking around me, acting like a paranoid schizophrenic. I wasn't exactly sure what this next day would bring, but fortunately, at least until about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, nothing. The other creepy thing is, when I tried to scout around the cabin to see where this large shape or thing was walking around the night before, sniffing and grunting, right where I heard it tapping against the walls, there was no point in looking for any tracks, because it had continuously snowed throughout the night, covering any evidence that there would ever be anything. Same thing with looking for tracks leading up to the cabin. The snow was fresh, and anything that would have remained was now buried and hidden. Fast forward to about 3 p.m. of that day, and while I hadn't had anything else happen since, this is where things began to get even more creepy. I started hearing my name being called from outside. Far away. I couldn't even begin to tell you the direction that I heard my name being called from. It sounded like it was coming from all around the cabin, and not just one direction, like a chorus of voices. And here's the eerie part. I was able to recognize each and every voice. Every single voice was the voice of dead relatives. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother, my great-uncle, and other relatives that have since long passed. I'm not exactly sure what was going on. Was I having a mental breakdown? Was being up here too much for my mind to handle? Was the isolation breaking my mind? Was I having severe altitude sickness? No, I was fine, up until I came here, up until the past few days, when all this began to happen. After the voices went on for probably 10 minutes, over and over, calling my name, telling me to follow, I stepped outside to see if I can pinpoint the direction from where this was coming from, when I saw the same original figure I did, on a different hillside, in about roughly the same distance as before, also just appearing as a dark silhouette, with no discernible real features. A skinny, gaunt figure that looked to be covered in animal skins, with very abnormally large shoulders, and a large head that appeared to be kind of like a caribou. I don't know if the head was like that, but the antlers were like that, where they're so oversized and huge, you can't even imagine how the head can keep those up. Now, I was going from psychotic to freaked out and paranoid, to terrified, scared, and gripping the machete that I kept at my side even tighter than I ever had before. Running back inside, I now deemed it not safe at all to be outside, period. And the only reason I should ever step foot out is to only ever get wood, and that was it. I made sure to close every curtain in the cabin, which there was only a few windows, so that wasn't a problem. Make sure both doors were locked, and stay low, hunker down, read, keep my mind as distracted as possible. But the noises, the voices, the haunting only ever persisted, worse than it ever has. As the evening progressed into nighttime, now I was hearing all sorts of disturbing noises, the sounds that had accompanied my cabin a few nights prior. The thing walking around, sniffing, grunting, like it was looking for a weak point to get in. Not to mention the ominous feelings, the voices of my dead relatives calling me, trying to lure me out of the cabin. And just as soon as it started, it all stopped, suddenly, sometime in the middle of the night. I had no idea why, or why the feelings and all the noises around me just suddenly went quiet. Then, maybe not even a moment later, noises began erupting off in the distance. That sound, like 2 Tyrannosaurus Rexes duking it out, was happening again. Only this time, it didn't sound like 2 giant reptiles fighting, like it had before. But that could have possibly just been because of the distortion of the distance and the ambiance of the environment around me. This sounded like beasts and demons fighting for their only meal. It was completely vicious in every sense of the word. I didn't even want to see what was happening, let alone hear it. It was just too frightening. It stopped after about an hour of ongoing racket, and then that was it. The rest of the night was dead silent. Nothing. You could barely even hear the breeze. I was too scared to even step outside to see if there had been anything that would cause the noise. Well, to be honest with you, I ended up cutting the trip shorter than expected, and instead of staying there all winter like I would have hoped to, I decided it wasn't safe to be up here anymore. After this going on for maybe 5 or 6 days in total, I needed to leave and abandon my journey. The following day, as I'm getting all my supplies ready to hop on the snowmobile and make it down to semi-civilization, things reappeared for a final time. As I'm getting everything ready, I look up and I see that same gaunt figure with the caribou horns not far in the distance, on the same hillside as I originally saw it. Only this time, it was moving toward me, not moving its legs as if it were walking through snow, but as if it were gliding through the snow, as if there was no resistance and nothing to hold it back from getting to me. Now I was terrified. I got ready as quickly as I could, which I only had a few bags to put on. Once I started it, and I began moving at a fast speed. You're probably not going to believe this, but as I turned back, I saw at least 3 or 4 of these giant black Doberman pinscher-looking wolves come out of nowhere, or from behind the trees, wherever they were concealed at, and jump and leap right toward this gaunt figure. I turned back to where I was going, and didn't want to watch what was about to ensue. The noises erupted again, of the same sounds that I had heard the night prior. The eruption of violence, like wild beasts fighting in the night. That's what I must have heard. 2 of these creatures, or demons, whatever they were fighting. I just remember thinking to myself on the way back down, I'm never coming back. This entire mountain, this entire place is cursed. With what? I don't know, but I never want to show up back here again. After speaking to my family, shortly after this stint, I pulled a few family members aside and spoke to them in private about what exactly I encountered going up there, thinking it was just some crazy hallucinations of being isolated. But in reality, I told them that my fears became nightmares as what I saw manifested into actual things that were the cause of my fears. They could do nothing but look down, remain quiet, while some of them told me they knew well that these things were up there, and that's part of the reason why they never went out there themselves. For whatever reason, keeping it from me, as if I would mock them, ridicule them, or for whatever reason I'm not sure. But I can thoroughly say that hands down, my little stint of survival up there in that cabin was easily the scariest moments of my life that I've ever experienced.